I was away for so long that my computer and the printer are no longer on speaking terms. So the notes are elsewhere and unprintable. So let's take a look at this passage that Carol read so well for us. If I said the name Rachel Held Evans, do any of you know that name? Yes. Okay. So Rachel Held Evans was a 37-year-old woman who I only knew through her blog and through the things that she said as she made her journey from being quite an evangelical, fundamentalist person of faith to beginning to question, and then to deciding that she could no longer live with the kinds of questions that she had. She could no longer live in her current church environment. And so on her journey, she moved into a category of folks that are called post-evangelical. And this is something that I heard a lot about on the course. There is a whole new category of people who are post-evangelical, who have moved out and away from a fundamentalist view of the faith and have started to entertain the questions and to develop a sense of curiosity and wondering about all the teachings that before they had just accepted. It is a huge phenomena in the States and also here in the Cascadia part of Canada. We don't notice it because we're part of the mainline churches, and the mainline churches hardly ever talk with the evangelical churches. And so it was an eye-opener to me. However, back to Rachel Held Evans, 37-year-old mother of two, wife. She became very ill 3 weeks ago, and they put her into a coma, a medically induced coma, and she died yesterday. And I never met her, but she made such a tremendous impression. She did very bold things. She wrote a book as she was kind of living her journey to become post-evangelical. She wrote a book, you know, that series of books, A Year Living Biblically, A Year Living. So she wrote a book called A Year of Living as a Biblical Woman. And she applied all the teachings that there were towards women in the Bible. She didn't speak in public. Thank goodness she was a blogger. She let her hair grow, even though her hair was not of a style that should have been grown out. She obeyed her husband in everything he said. He grew very tired of that because he felt he had married an equal partner. And so in this year of living as a biblical woman, she said, Like these things that the Bible teaches, this isn't what we think of as life for people, for women of our day and age. This is outdated. When she had her period, she moved into a tent on their front yard. All these things, her family and her friends said, "This is ridiculous. What are we doing to modern day women that we teach this?" So she progressed on her journey, and in sharing the story of her kind of awakening curiosity and wondering, and her steps into post-evangelical and then into being a progressive Christian, she just so generously shared the struggles that she had that people you just went to her blog. If you didn't have time to read anything else, you went to her blog because she was so with it and so insightful. So with her passing, I thought to myself, it's such a big thing in my life and in the life of the post-Christian community. I thought, I just have to tell you folks. And then I realized that I was doing the same thing that the two people on the road to Emmaus are doing. There's been a horrible thing has happened in Jerusalem. Something that they didn't expect, that they didn't want, that they couldn't prevent, and Jesus has been killed by the Roman authorities as an insurgent. They're so devastated that they have to talk to each other. They have to tell the stories. They go into great detail about what they understand to have been the last days and minutes of his life. That's what we do, isn't it? When tragedy, when dismay overtakes us, we look for community. We turn to our friends and we say, "Can I tell you what's happened?" Because we're not meant to be alone. We live in community, and we need each other, especially at these difficult times. And so the two of these folks are walking to Emmaus, and they're telling each other the stories and the details of the last weeks and days of Jesus' life. They're so focused on that when this person comes to join them, they don't even recognize him. Now, I'm curious about that. I'm curious about that because it seems to me that, like, Jesus doesn't look like this resurrection thing is not a physical resurrection where he comes looking as he did when he was still alive. No, I'm curious as to whether or not the resurrection isn't in fact something spiritual. And so they don't recognize the one who walks with them physically. But as he listens to them, And then finally he says, friends, you've missed the point. This isn't just about me and my death. He says, I'm part of a much longer story. Do you remember what the prophets way back when said? Do you remember how they called for justice? How they called for a new vision of how God was active in the world? And so starting way back then, he told the story of his life as a link in the chain and the progression and the evolving understanding of what God desired. What kind of kingdom was God looking for? What kind of way did God think people should live together in community? Do you remember that line from Martin Luther King? And I'm not going to quote it exactly right. But Martin Luther King said, "The long arc of history bends towards justice." But you don't see that long arc of history in just a moment. You see it as you look and interpret and see that each story of a faithful presence is part of building a link and of helping to arc the world towards justice. I find that helpful to think of myself and to think of all of us, to think of this congregation as part of a long arc, a continuation where we don't see the subtle shifts that happen when we look in detail at any one thing. But as we look at the long arc of history, we see that progress is happening. We see that a spiritual awakening is indeed happening. So, what I take from this part of this story is that we have our own individual story, but we do not live independently of the long story that comes behind us. And that we each in our part build for the story that is evolving and unfolding. Does that make sense to people? It's the same with churches and congregations and movements that happen. The journey that Rachel Held Evans took has released so many people to question and to think differently. And so, even though her life is all too short, she has made her mark in the process of liberation and egalitarianism. And I think that's what is hoped for each of us and for we as a congregation, that we just contribute in as positive a way as we can to the evolving sense of spiritual liberation and freedom that is going to be the part, and the place is going to be part of history. So that's all I really have to say today. Thank you for listening.